So we're very fortunate that our third panelist indeed did arrive. And, oh, thank you. Again, I really want you to read the full bio, but very briefly, Craig Murray is a former British ambassador to Uzbekistan and now broadcaster and human rights activist. As ambassador, Craig has set the courageous example of speaking up about inhuman practices involved in the so-called war on terror, which cost him his diplomatic career. I'll turn it over to you now, Craig. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to share some thoughts with you today. I'm going to be speaking at more length tomorrow at the Sam Adams presentation, but today I wanted to talk to you about something I've never spoken about before, in fact, which is the experiences I had negotiating a peace treaty in Sierra Leone, and how the same people turn out to be behind wars, and I mean the same individual, in very different parts of the world. When I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, where the United States was cooperating with a dreadful dictatorship and where the CIA was sending people to be tortured as part of the Extraordinary Rendition Program, the reason for that alliance was mainly that American companies, initially Enron, in fact, had signed contracts to monopolize Uzbekistan's natural gas reserves, and there was a plan to build a pipeline from Central Asia over Afghanistan, which was to be built by a company called Unocal. And the contract between Enron and the government of Uzbekistan was actually signed in the office of the governor of Texas while George W. Bush was governor of Texas. And George H.W. Bush was on the board of Unocal, who were meant to build the pipeline over Afghanistan. And that was the reason, if you like, for the Uzbek-US alliance, which I found, particularly the extraordinary rendition part, unconscionable, which I tried to stop, and instead I got sacked. But I want to talk about something earlier in my career, when I was the head of the UK delegation to the peace talks in Sierra Leone, because I think Sierra Leone's quite interesting. In the United Kingdom, the British invasion of Sierra Leone, which was 2000 or 2001, is held up as the example of humanitarian military intervention that shows that humanitarian military intervention works. And I want to explain to you why that's not true, and also give you some background as to why international diplomacy doesn't work, because essentially the people in power don't want it to work. I was in charge of policy towards Sierra Leone in the UK when I was deputy head of the Africa department of the British Foreign Office. And Sierra Leone is an interesting example of colonial legacy problems which destroy a country. And you usually find most of the conflicts in Africa, which we describe as tribal, actually date back. The root cause is colonial settlement and the moving of peoples from their land and the resulting dislocation. In Sierra Leone, it's interesting, because Sierra Leone, which neighbours Liberia, was the British example. It was a colony set up for freed slaves. So the people who set it up had ostensibly good motives. The problem is, of course, to the locals, if you're being dispossessed and moved off your land, you don't actually care if it's a white man or a freed slave who's doing it to you. What happened in Sierra Leone was you ended up with a coastal elite of freed slaves who spoke English and therefore had advantages in trading with Europe. And the native population was displaced, and the tribes of the interior were neglected. Throughout West Africa, it's very often the case that because of trading links with Europe, which go back hundreds of years, the coastal tribes were richer and wealthier than the inland ones, and so they tend to disproportionately hold power. This was exacerbated by the introduction of freed slaves in both Liberia and Sierra Leone. And the result was that you had a social system whereby the people of the coast were much wealthier and much better educated than the people of the interior. And that fed in to extremely corrupt governments and into a huge amount of resentment among the peoples of the interior, made worse by some terrible colonial atrocities. There was what's known as the Hutt Tax War in Sierra Leone in the 1870s, when the British fairly well exterminated large parts of the interior population by imposing a tax on their huts, literally. And when they refused to pay this tax, people's homes and villages were simply destroyed and populations were massacred. And that the Hutt Tax War of Sierra Leone doesn't exist in any official history of the British Empire. You could read everything written by, history nowadays is mostly neocon propaganda. You can read Niall Ferguson's best-selling History of the British Empire, for example, and not discover the British ever did anything wrong at all. But you had this bitter, bitter legacy, and then you had a massively corrupt government. So when the Sierra Leone War and the Liberian Civil War next door, and the two are very much linked, erupted, and you saw all those terrible pictures of people, you may recall in Sierra Leone, the rebels chopped off with machetes people's arms routinely. Did it to tens of thousands of people had their arms chopped off. But it wasn't a manifestation of uncaused evil, if you like. The British government policy was very much that the rebels must be terrible, dreadful people, they're chopping people's arms off, these are devils, we must just get in and kill them all, and that will solve the problem. But the problem is, no matter how inhumanitarian an act may be, no matter how appalling an action is, there is always a cause. Human beings are human beings. The people doing this were human beings like you and me, and I'll discuss that a little more in a moment. People don't suddenly erupt into chopping people's arms off without something having gone terribly wrong in history that turned them that way. This was something the British government didn't want to hear. When I was saying to them, listen, what we have to do is find the grievances and causes of extreme poverty and extreme alienation that causes this kind of thing to happen, they were saying, no, we just need to shoot them. We had a situation where the official narrative, if you like, was that the elected government of President Kaba had been deposed in a coup by the armed forces and these rebels. And that was true as far as it goes. But it didn't account for the fact that the elected government was incredibly corrupt, as all its predecessors had been, and that resources were incredibly concentrated among a tiny number of people. I found myself in the year 1999 in Lomé in Togo, locked in a hotel room with the Sierra Leone government, with the representatives of the rebels, the RUF, with representatives of the governments of Liberia and Libya. At the time, that was Charles Taylor's people and Colonel Gaddafi's people, with an American ambassador named Joe Melrose and his staff, and the United Nations, who were cheering the talks, and we had to try to get a peace treaty together in these circumstances. And when I say we were locked in, we were literally locked in. You would get shot if you tried to go out. Even I might have got shot if I tried to go out. A German diplomat was shot dead in Togo in 1995 by the Togolese. So it was not a safe place. And I recall sitting there before the Americans turned up a week late, I know not why. But when we, in the very first session, I sat there and I looked around, and there were all these rebels from the RUF. There were two very hard men from the Sierra Leonean government. There were 3 representatives of Colonel Gaddafi and 4 representatives of Charles Taylor. And I thought, do you know, I'm the only man in the room who's never killed anybody. I got to know some of the rebels, and I want to tell you about a guy called Colonel Isaac. Now, Colonel Isaac had killed over 100 people himself. He had killed over 100 people. And he chopped the arms of hundreds more, personally done that. Colonel Isaac was a colonel in the rebels, and he was 19 years old. He had at the age of 8, been captured by Charles Taylor's people and forced to kill his own mother and father. He'd then been used as a child soldier by Charles Taylor's people. He'd fought in the Liberian Civil War, and at one stage he'd been shipped off with other child soldiers to fight in the war in Angola. And that's something I didn't realize before I got there, that there was a traffic in child soldiers for money around Africa. And he had, he was, in many ways, he was a terrible war criminal. He'd killed hundreds of people. He was a monster, but he was also, an 8-year-old boy who'd had to kill his own parents, who'd seen his sisters raped and murdered in front of him, and who had been totally dehumanized and had never had a chance. And I'm not a very conventional diplomat at all, and as you may notice. My negotiating tactic, if you like, was to sit round and to socialize with them, not only see them in the formal sessions. And I don't actually take hard drugs myself, just because I don't happen to like them, not from any moral reason, but they would sit around taking cocaine, and I would sit around drinking whiskey, and we'd talk deep into the evening. And Colonel Isaac's hope was from the peace process that he would get an education, that he'd be taught how to read and write, and eventually he wanted to go to college. That's what he hoped would come out of it. And we were putting together a peace treaty whereby the rebels, the RUF, would get 4 or 5 ministers in the government. They were bidding for 8 ministers in the government. The government of Sierra Leone wanted to give them 2 ministers. But you imagine that. You're putting all the people who would have been put into that government were mass murderers. There's no doubt about it. And you think of the ethical difficulties that arise here, because they are really profound. And I found them personally profound. I mean, it wasn't just a question of an intellectual exercise. I would go back every night. Some nights I would cry after hearing some of these stories and try to figure out how we did it. Eventually, we did manage to piece together the signing of a peace agreement for which Jesse Jackson flew into town. And I'm very, very sorry if this disillusions any of you. It disillusions me. He's a horrible person. He came off the plane and he'd sent an assistant out to prepare the ground ahead of him. He came out of the plane, and I was to travel with him in the car on the way in from the airport to brief him on what had been happening. And this young female assistant who'd been sent ahead of him, he just yelled and screamed at her the entire way in because there'd been no television cameras at the airport. And she was trying to point out to him there are no television cameras in Togo, but it didn't seem to help. But he was, as purely an aside, never meet your heroes because they turn out to be horrible. We got the peace agreement signed and had enormous... persuading... one of the things that was to be done was that the rebel army, the RUF, was to be turned into a political party. I spent ages trying to persuade the British aid agency that they ought to put up money to help fund. It was desks and photocopiers and that kind of things that you need if you're becoming a political party. They were saying, these people are murderers and criminals, we're not giving them anyway. We pieced something together. And I was stuck in that hotel for about 2 months. Over that period, I saw people on both sides gradually come together and get to talk to each other and look like they could work together. The agreement held for about a year, then fighting broke out again, and then the British invaded. I think the agreement did save. When we started negotiating the agreement, people were dying at about 10,000 a month. For the year after the agreement, about 500 people a month died. So I think we achieved something. Whether the agreement could ever completely have stuck, I don't know. But there's no doubt at all that the British government connived at unsticking it. Neither the British nor the American government provided any of the things they said they were going to provide. And in fact, really it was buying time the agreement. And I should say, I didn't know this at the time I negotiated it. But it was in effect buying time in order to prepare for the British military invasion, which came on in. And I was being used as a tool, if you like, by my own government, which didn't tell me what it was doing. But I want to tell you this. Sierra Leone is famous for blood diamonds. It's probably the biggest source of blood diamonds in the world. And much of the conflict was fueled by the control of blood diamonds. But there's something in Sierra Leone which is even more valuable, and that's titanium. Now, there's a mineral, and you must forgive me, I can't pronounce the letter R very well. It's called rutile, R-U-T-I-L-E. There's a mineral called rutile, of which Sierra Leone, I believe, is the biggest source in the world, and it's extremely valuable. And the Sierra Leone Rutile Company owns what I think is the world's largest rutile mining operation, which is owned by Titanium Resources Group. Now, after the British Army took over, Sierra Leone really reverted to something like colonial status because there was a British head of the Ministry of Finance, the chief of police was British, expatriate British people were put into all the sort of key positions in government. The diamond mines fell into hands happy, with which the City of London were helpful. And the titanium, all of it, came under the control of the Titanium Resources Group. And Titanium Resources Group, which still owns all of Sierra Leone's titanium, the chair is a guy called Walter Cansteiner III. And he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under George Bush at the time of the talks and at the time of the British invasion. And you can look this up, you can check this. He was also a founding partner of the Scowcroft Group, along with Brent Scowcroft. So these are the same people, and Scowcroft, of course, devised the Torture and Extraordinary Rendition program that I came across later in Afghanistan. I told you, you find the same people making money behind the wars all over the world. And I can tell you that as something I've personally witnessed, not as an abstract academic theory. In places as diverse as Sierra Leone and Uzbekistan, I came across the money-making proclivities of these people, the urgent desire of these people to grab world resources as directly causing war and death of the most appalling kind. And another member of the board of Titanium Resources Group is a lady called Baroness Amos. Now, she was a British Minister for Overseas Development at the time of those negotiations, and the lady who refused to put in the resources to make the peace deal work. And she is now, and they're not there as government representatives, they're there entirely as private individuals with shares in Titanium Resources Group. And my conclusion from this is that even in the most appalling and unlikely circumstances, and even in dealing with the knottiest of moral problems, it is possible to start to find a way through, but that there will never be a peaceful resolution of disputes all around the world as long as Western countries retain their current political and economic power structures. Because the only thing that's going to stop this is removing the concentration of capital and the concentration of political power in tiny hands, in a tiny number of hands, of rather evil people who truly do aspire to global domination of the world's resources. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Craig and Kathy and Mel.